So in the first part of the lecture, we looked at what ethical egoism is, but we haven't yet given any positive reasons or any arguments for why we should be ethical egoisms. Now, James Rachels, in his paper, which is one of the readings for today's lecture, investigates and very much scrutinizes ethical egoism. So he thinks there are three arguments you might give in favor of ethical egoism. The first is what you can call the pragmatic argument. This argument basically says, look, it's actually in everyone's best interest to pursue only your self-interest. So if everyone's going around just pursuing their own self-interest, then everyone's going to get what's in their own self-interest and everyone's going to get the best thing overall. Of course, there might be clashes here or there between people's self-interest, but overall, it's going to be better for everyone if everyone's just doing what's good for them. Then you have the argument from individual value. This argument basically says, look, morality can't require you to do stuff that's not in your self-interest. It's actually morally repugnant if somebody requires you to do something that's not in your self-interest. So the thought here is, it's not necessarily good for everyone else that you act in your own self-interest and that everybody acts in their own self-interest. It's rather that there's something bad, there's something actually morally wrong about trying to force you. Like if morality tries to force you to do something that's not in your best interest, then that's bad. Then there's the explanatory argument. So the explanatory argument is rather, it's not making these other points, that it's really good for everyone or there's any kind of moral repugnance associated with not acting in your own self-interest. Rather saying that, we can explain all moral obligations from the requirement to pursue your own self-interest. So if you think of other obligations that you might have, benefiting others or being just, these kinds of things, the thought here is that those all derive from our own self-interest. So perhaps, benefiting others is, you have an obligation to do that because, you benefit others, then they might do things that are good for you. And if you're just, then that's also in your self-interest because then other people will support a system of justice. And ultimately, everything derives from a duty of self-interest, and we can explain these other duties. Rachels himself, as you'll see in the paper, doesn't think that any of these arguments are very good. Now, if you're interested in learning more about those arguments, I'd recommend going to read the Rachels paper and investigating that more. We're now going to focus on arguments against ethical egoism. So Rachels also considers three arguments. And it's the last of which I want to focus on here, because it's the last argument against ethical egoism that Rachels thinks is the best one. And the main thrust of this argument against ethical egoism is that ethical egoism seems to assume that there's something special about you. And Rachels just basically said, well, what makes you so special? If we can't identify something that's special about you as a particular individual, there's no reason why morality ought to pick out each person's individual self-interest as what makes things moral or what grounds moral duties. So the core thought here is that morality isn't arbitrary. Because think about it this way, ethical egoism morally requires you, that you only and exclusively consider your own interest. So morality is focused on you. And for each individual person, morality is focused on each individual person. So it seems like morality is making an exception for each person. That you're special. There's something different about you. Because you're yourself, you should put yourself before everyone else, morally. But Rachels thinks that you need to give some non-arbitrary reason for this exclusivity consideration. We need some reason, which isn't just, oh, you're you, for why you ought to put yourself before everyone else all the time, ethically, not just as a matter of prudence, but actually ethically. Morality actually requires that. So if we accept ethical egoism, then we'll treat ourselves and everyone else very differently. So we'll put ourselves first, and everyone else will only do things for other people if it's in the service of furthering our own interests. But Rachel says, but there's no general difference between oneself and others to which each person can appeal that justifies this difference in treatment. So the thought here is that, again, what's special about you? If you're going to say that morality says that you and each individual should put their own self-interest first, there needs to be something special, something different about each individual person, something that makes you different from others. That means that you put yourself first. It can't just be that you are you, because it seems fairly arbitrary. You need something a bit more substantial, a bit more explanatory. And because he thinks that ethical egoism can't offer that, he thinks it's just going to be unacceptably arbitrary. It's just, you've decided that, you should go first and put yourself first before others, and everyone else is doing that. But why? Well, we need an answer. We need an explanation. It can't just be that you are you. We need something more than that. So he says, each of us can ask, what is the difference between myself and others that justifies placing myself in a special category? So you might wonder, well, I'm more intelligent. Do I enjoy life more? Are my accomplishments greater? Do I have needs or abilities that are so different from the needs or abilities of others? So here you're thinking, can I find something that makes me special? Can I find something that sets me apart and means that I should put my interest before the interest of everyone else, and that everyone else should do that too? Again, Rachel says, can you answer the question, what makes me so special? Well, Rachel thinks, no, you can't answer that. There's nothing that sets you apart from others. You're just like other people. Everyone else has their own interests, their own motives, their own desires, their own projects. They all have those. The only thing that's true about yours is they're yours, but we need something more than that. For you to then say that morality is telling you and each particular individual that they ought to pursue only their own interests and projects at the expense of everyone else's. So Rachel thinks the ethical egoist can't provide an answer here, and so it's unacceptably arbitrary. So the thought here is that from the point of view of morality, right, there's nothing special about you as against anyone else. So morality here is clearly something that goes beyond just each individual person's interest. It's something outside of people. Now, it could be that morality decides that it is actually the case that morality says people should put themselves before others. But then we'd need some special reason for each individual to do that. And Rachel thinks that if we're thinking about morality and from the point of view of morality, then there's nothing special about us. Now, there might be something special about you from your own standpoint, but that's from your own standpoint. That's not from the standpoint or the point of view of morality. So we might wonder, is Rachel right about that? Is there not anything that makes you special from the point of view of morality? There's something to think about. You might always think your acts are yours, your life is yours, and your interests are yours. These are all true, right? These are all the things that are true about you. Now, of course, as I've said, that is true of other people as well. So these things don't seem to set you apart from others. One thing that you might want to say is that, well, maybe I should put my life and my interest before others just because they're mine. But we need an answer. The ethical egoist needs an answer to how that makes a difference from the point of view of morality, something that Rachel thinks we can't get. But what we're now going to consider is an argument for ethical egoism from psychological egoism. So now we're going to first introduce psychological egoism, and then we'll get to the argument from psychological egoism to ethical egoism. So psychological egoism is the view that the only thing each person is capable of pursuing is their own self-interest. Notice here the difference. Ethical egoism is talking about what morality is telling you what to do, whereas psychological egoism is making a psychological claim. It's telling you something that is true about people, just a matter of fact about people. So if psychological egoism and ethical egoism were true, then this gives us a new answer to our core question. If psychological egoism is true, I'm always pursuing my own self-interest. And that's actually all I can do. So if you're only capable of pursuing your own self-interest, then that's all you're possible. It's all that's possible for you to do. And as we're going to see, the argument that goes from psychological egoism to ethical egoism says that, not only capable of pursuing your own self-interest, that's actually morally what you ought to do. So why be good? Well, because it's the only thing you can do. Because if you're always pursuing your own self-interest, then you're always going to be doing what's good, because you're always acting in your own self-interest. If psychological egoism is right, that's all you're capable of. And if ethical egoism is right, then that's actually what's morally required of you. So by pursuing your own self-interest, and if that's all you're capable of doing, then you're always going to be doing good. And not only just are you always going to be doing good, that's what's actually required of you. So let's now consider similarities and differences between ethical and psychological egoism. So both are about what we pursue. So they're both talking about our motivations, aims, and our will more generally. And both are also focused on our ends as opposed to our means. So ethical egoism is saying that the only thing that each person should pursue is their own self-interest. So it's about the should. It's a normative, ethical, moral should there. Whereas psychological egoist is talking about capabilities, but still what you're capable of pursuing. And the object of your pursuit here is your own self-interest in both cases, in both the case of ethical egoism and psychological egoism. So it also says both views are focused on ends rather than means. So let's think about means and ends. Here's one possible end. You want to get a fancy job where you earn lots of money. Now that's an end that would be in your own self-interest. So means would be ways to achieve that end. So what would be the means of achieving this end, of getting this fancy job with a high salary? Well, it might be studying really hard and going to university and suffering through lots of philosophy lectures and writing essays and so on and so on. This might be the means to your end. It might be, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to go to university, I'm going to go through all these classes and so on and so forth, because I want to get this fancy job that's going to make me rich and powerful. Another end might be, you want to buy a house. And what do you need to buy a house? Well, you need lots of money. And so you have to get lots of money. And one way of getting lots of money would be to get this high-flying job here. So your high-flying job could end up being a means to getting all this money and the end of getting the house. So importantly, both ethical egoism and psychological egoism are about ends. So the thought here is that ends in themselves, the ends, the things we're aiming for, the outcomes that we're striving for, those are the things that have to be in our self-interest. Our means might not be in our self-interest, but for the psychological egoist, our ends are anything in the end, anything that we're aiming for will be something that's in our self-interest, even if along the way to get those things that are in our self-interest, we do things that are not in our self-interest. The thought is that we'll be doing those things that are not in our self-interest as a way of getting things that are in our self-interest. And indeed, the ethical egoist would allow that it's morally acceptable to do things that are not in your self-interest as long as it gets you something that is in your self-interest. As long as your ends are in your self-interest, for the ethical egoist, you're doing what's morally right. And the psychological egoist thinks that you're just not actually capable of striving for things which are not in your own self-interest. So these are both strong interpretations of psychological egoism and ethical egoism. It's these strong interpretations we're going to be working with today. So both views are about pursuing ends in themselves and not as means to any other ends. So again, remember, for the psychological egoist, this is about what you're capable of. All you're capable of pursuing as an end in itself are things in your own self-interest. Whereas the ethical egoist thinks that, the morally right thing to do, the morally acceptable thing to do for each and every person is to pursue as an end in itself things that are in each and every person's self-interest and their own self-interest. So think about the difference between ethical egoism and normative egoism. Ethical egoism, as you probably noticed, and I've said a few times, involves a should claim, a normative claim. It's telling you about how things ideally ought to be, things that ought to move you to action. Psychological egoism, on the other hand, is making a descriptive claim. It's telling you about how things actually are. So if psychological egoism is true, it's just a matter of fact that each and every person ultimately acts on their own self-interest. If ethical egoism is true, it's not making a claim about reality. It's telling you how things ideally ought to be or what people should do, like what the world should be like, not what the world is like. So if ethical egoism is true, the morally right thing to do is to act in your own self-interest. But ethical egoism could be true, but psychological egoism not. So it could be that people are capable of not acting in their own self-interest, but they morally ought to, and vice versa. It could be that, at least possible, that psychological egoism is true, but ethical egoism isn't. As we'll see, the argument from psychological egoism to ethical egoism suggests that there is a link between the two, but at least on the face of it, these two things come apart. So just beware, as a terminological note, we're talking about ethical egoism and psychological egoism, but these are often called different names in the philosophical literature. Sometimes ethical egoism goes by normative egoism, and sometimes psychological egoism goes by descriptive egoism. It's always something to be aware of when you're reading. So often philosophers describe things using different terms, but they sometimes mean the same things. Even more confusing is when they use the same terms to mean different things, but that's not the case here. But just something to be wary of. Focus on what they mean by the words, not on the labels they attach. This can often lead people astray. Importantly here, look, normative does not imply descriptive, and descriptive does not imply normative. As I've said, on the face of it, ethical egoism could be true, but psychological egoism not, and vice versa. Just in general, if something's normative, it doesn't imply just something is true about the world. It's just telling you, it's giving you an ought claim or should claim, telling you what the world is would ideally be like, whether from the standpoint of morality or some other normative domain, like aesthetic domain or the epistemic domain. And descriptive does not imply normative. So just because the world is a particular way doesn't mean it ought to be that way. It was a matter of fact that, there's lots of violence and crime in the world. That doesn't mean that there ought to be lots of violence and crime in the world. Could be it seems plausible there ought not be lots of violence and crime in the world. And so clearly the fact that there is violence and crime doesn't mean that there ought to be. So I want to focus now on psychological egoism a bit more for a moment. So think about any of your voluntary actions, right? Ask yourself, why did I do that? Is my end always self-interested? Is my motive always self-interest? So you might think, yes, I always act in my self-interest, but is that always your end? Is that always like what you're ultimately aiming for? People, as a matter of fact, do act on their own self-interest quite a lot. But does each and every person always act on their own self-interest? Are they always, in the end, aiming for things that are in their self-interest? The psychological egoist says yes. And in fact says we aren't even capable of doing anything else. It's not the case that people just choose to act in their own self-interest. It's just that that's all they're capable of. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I've got the popularity of this idea and perhaps the allure of this idea. I want to play a short clip from a hit 1990s TV series that some of you may have heard of. I'm not sure how popular it is these days, but it was very popular at the time in my youth. So in this episode, one of the characters, Joey, is trying to convince another one of the characters, Phoebe, that there's no such thing as a selfless deed. And ultimately, Joey here seems to be taking the role of a psychological egoist.
Sorry, Phoebes. I just wanted to do a good deed, like you did with the babies.
This isn't a good deed. You just want to get on TV. This is totally selfish.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. What about you having those babies for your brother? Talk about selfish.
What are you talking about?
Well, yeah, it was a really nice thing and all, but it made you feel really good, right?
Yeah, so?
Well, it made you feel good, so that makes it selfish. Look, there's no unselfish good deeds, sorry.
Yes, there are. There are totally good deeds that are selfless.
Well, may I ask for one example?
Yeah, it's, you know, there's... No, you may not.
That's because all people are selfish.
Are you calling me selfish?
Are you calling you people? Yeah, well, sorry to burst that bubble, Phoebes, but selfless good deeds don't exist, okay? And you know the deal on Santa Claus, right?
I'm gonna find a selfless good deed. I'm gonna beat you, you evil genius.
So, oh, skipping ahead there. So clearly in this clip here, Joey here, the psychological egoist, he thinks that there's no selfless good deed. He just thinks that it can't be done. Ultimately, he's claiming that even if we try to do something that's not selfish, in the end, it's going to have some benefit for us. And in the end, it's going to benefit us and be in our self-interest. Now, as we'll see at the end of the lecture, there might be ways in which you can criticize the psychological egoism of Joey Tribbiani. This is perhaps not the most philosophically sophisticated, but at least communicates that it's a very common idea. People often think that, yes, we ultimately do always act on our own ends. But hopefully by the end of the lecture, perhaps you can see the error in Joey's reasoning.